Hello, everyone. Welcome, welcome. We're excited to host a very special guest today, Dr. Alfred Flores, to talk about his book, Tip of the Spear. And before we get into formal introductions, I would like to introduce doctoral candidate Kehaulani Falau from Education, Culture, and Society, who's a current graduate assistant for the Pacific Island Studies program, who will be doing the formal introductions of Dr. Flores. Thank you, Kehaulani.
Thank you, Dr. Kehaulani Vaughn. Half a day, everyone. I have the honor and privilege to introduce Dr. Alfred P. Flores. Dr. Flores is an assistant professor of Asian American Studies at Harvey Mudd College. His research and teaching focuses on diaspora, labor, indigeneity, militarization, oral history, and settler colonialism in Micronesia. He is the author of Tip of the Spear, Land, Labor, and U.S. Settler Militarism in Guåhan, 1944 to 1962, published by Cornell University Press just last year in 2023. His previous work has appeared in Amerasia Journal, American Quarterly, Critical Ethnic Studies Journal, Okinawan Journal of Island Studies, and Oxford Research Encyclopedia of American History. It's great to have you here, and thank you for letting me do the intro.
Good day, everyone, and greetings. I have to say it is a privilege to be with an honor and a privilege to be with you all virtually today. I'd like to say Sainamati and a sincere thank you to Dr. Kehaulani Vaughn, also Dr. Miley Arvin for inviting me to give this talk today. So thank you very much for your support, hospitality, and generosity. I'd also like to thank Kehaulani Falau and then also Estela Hernandez for helping to organize my virtual visit with you all today. So thank you for your labor and especially your care. I'd like to also thank the co-sponsors, which I believe are the School for Social and Cultural Transformation and the American West Center for making this event also possible. And of course, all of you who are virtually in the audience today. It's one of those things where when I have a chance to give these talks, I always think of the notion or concept of care. And so for those of you who are in the virtual crowd, or those of you who can't be here, for those who can't be here today, or for people like Dr. Kehaulani Vaughn and Cal Falau, thank you for your care. Because really your care, the care that you give me in being here today, and also over the years, and the mentorship and the kinship that I have with many of you who might be in the audience, has truly supported me in the making of this book. That's what I guess I'm trying to say. So care is such an important part to making things like this really come to fruition. So I really appreciate all of you sincerely. I'd also like to acknowledge the Ahashiman and Tongva communities and their ancestors past and future. I'm speaking to you today from Fullerton, California, which is in North Orange County. And these are the folks that call Orange County as their ancestral homeland. And so I believe, looking to them, their histories, their stories, their survival is inspiration for how we should strive to take care of our communities and the land, ocean, and sky. So just a couple of things that I wanted to mention. And I also wanted to say, as customary in CHamoru culture and other indigenous and oceanic communities, I'd also like to introduce my family. So on my paternal side, my father's side, I come from the families of Kulu, from the village of Zolnya, and from my other clan name on my grandfather's side, my grandfather's side is Kabesa, from the village of Totu. And on my mother's side, I am Korean from the family Kim and from Seoul, South Korea. So I like to just acknowledge my family, and because I believe a lot of times when we come into these spaces, we bring not just our own energy, our own spirit, but also the spirits of our ancestors with us. So I just wanted to share that with you as I begin. And then finally, in recognizing this is both an academic and community virtual space, I would like to apologize in advance if my presentation offends anyone who is or has family in the U.S. military. As many of you know, many of our folks, many of our Pacific Islander folks, have entered into and participated in the military in a variety of different ways and for a variety of reasons. And so my goal today is not to critique those individual choices that people make for participating or entering the military. It is about critiquing the structural powers that have created these conditions, and to also tell a story of what life was like before the hyper-militarization of the island of Guam during World War II. So I'd like to begin my presentation by briefly discussing my background and research. For me, research is both personal and professional. As a CHamoru and diasporic Korean who grew up in Southern California, my experiences of learning about my CHamoru culture were rooted in the time I spent on my paternal grandparents' Lantsu, or also known as ranch, located in Paris, California. For those of you who might know California or Paris, California, that is also known and referred to as the Inland Empire. My grandparents' Lantsu had a profound impact on my life because it was the foundation for my understanding of CHamoru culture. Culture, excuse me. They frequently demonstrated the CHamoru principle of an alpha malik, which means generally to make good, through their decisions and actions that were geared toward helping family, friends, and even acquaintances. This was done through the hosting of people long-term or short-term that needed maybe a place to stay or live. They also hosted large-scale fiestas, rosaries, birthday parties that were only possible through the animals they ranched and the outdoor kitchen that could literally feed hundreds of people. In many ways, their Lantsu was extraordinary because they built a place that had the sights, smells, and sounds that you would find in the Mariana Islands. It is these memories that influenced the research of my book, which is centered on the relationships between people and the land. Furthermore, the presence and settling of my family on Kauai and Luiseño lands has encouraged me to learn more about the structural forces that have shaped the experiences of Chamorros and other Native and Indigenous people who have endured U.S. settler colonialism. Now, my presentation today is a chapter from my book, as you can see, titled Tip of the Spear. To begin, I'll give a brief overview of the entire book that includes a discussion of the main questions, the research methodology, and the contributions that I believe the book makes. I will then spend the remaining time discussing chapter 1. So the three main questions that animate this project are: one, or the book, I should say, is when and how did Guåhan become the tip of America's spear? And just for clarification, if you don't know, tip of the spear usually refers to the use of a combat force that pierces an enemy's first line of defense. So this is, obviously a military phrase. Second, what effect did it have on the lives of those who lived on the island? And third, how have Chamorros survived U.S. settler militarism? So these were the three questions that really guided the research and the writing of the project. Now, as an interdisciplinary historian, I utilized a combination of archival records and oral histories to write this book. This included conducting archival research in 13 different sites located in the continental United States, Guåhan, Hawaii, and the Philippines. These sources revealed the intricate and complicated ways that settler militarism functions and the precarious nature that comes with studying the U.S. military. However, at times, the archives also revealed Chamorro voices that rebuked the military and demonstrated various forms of cultural continuity that are used to unmask the narratives and discourse that justified military occupation. In addition to textual sources, I also relied on oral histories to center the experiences of the people who have survived U.S. military occupation. Like other Native communities, Chamorros rely on oral tradition, or also known colloquially as talking story, to create, document, and pass knowledge from one generation to the next. This book includes 30 interviews I conducted with Chamorro, Filipino, and white American elders in Guåhan and throughout the diaspora who have all been impacted by settler militarism, plus dozens of other oral history interviews that I found in the archives located in Guåhan. But my approach to oral history isn't simply about source material. It is also my commitment to community-oriented research that is predicated on my responsibility to the people I write about. For example, many of the people I interviewed were found through family, friends, and acquaintances I had made during my time as a grassroots community-based organizer. Specifically, I co-founded an organization called Famagsaisen that sponsored an annual conference and held community workshops that promoted Chamorro cultural revitalization and fought for demilitarization. This experience was poignant for me because it taught me the importance of community-engaged research that is based on the principles of responsibility, obligation, and respect. So to me, what I didn't know at that time was that the relationships I was building would actually be formative in the sense that I would provide the groundwork, for me being able to do the oral history research that I would later come to fruition through my dissertation or through my PhD program. In Tip of the Spear, I encourage new ways of understanding military bases and occupation through this term or concept known as settler militarism. As Juliet Nebelon argues, settler militarism illustrates how, quote, settler colonialism and militarization have simultaneously perpetuated, legitimated, and concealed one another. My primary argument is that the US military occupation of Guåhan during World War II and the Cold War was based on a co-constitutive process that included Chamorro land dispossession and the creation of a hierarchical labor system that was predicated on race and nationality. One of the ways that settler militarism functioned was through American periodicals that were instrumental in creating a discourse that justified the transformation of the island into a major military site that was based on notions of military philanthropy and modernity. Now, in order to deal with the island's rapid demographic change that came with this hyper-militarization, the US military implemented laws that policed the various interracial intimacies that were enabled by settler militarism. Essentially, the cohering of these ideas, policies, and people comprised the infrastructure of empire that was integral to how Guåhan's military bases came into existence and were maintained. Now, following anthropologist David Vine, I incorporated an expansive definition of bases as a way to reveal the interconnections across a variety of military sites and sites, such as airfields, civilian military labor camps, communication stations, firing ranges, military hospitals, recreational facilities, roads, war memorials, and anything basically built, right, or associated with the military. Now, moving into the contributions of the book, the first one I believe that it makes is when it comes to studies on settler colonialism. Typically, when scholars discuss settler colonialism in Oceania, they usually and understandably focus on Aotearoa, New Zealand, Australia, and Hawaii, because these are settler majority places. However, I argue that Guåhan provides a unique opportunity because it demonstrates that settler colonialism does not simply require the presence of a settler majority. Rather, military bases in Guåhan were able to maintain themselves through a small but constant influx of settlers that included laborers, dependents, and soldiers. In turn, these bases and their technologies of war desecrate the land, lives, and bring the potential of mass elimination to all of the people living in the Western Pacific, and not just in Guåhan. So this is where the work of scholars such as Hanani K. Trask, Ned Blackhawk, and Patrick Wolf remind us of the centrality of violence in settler colonialism. The land that these bases were then constructed upon were largely acquired through institutions and laws and discourse that the US military controlled. In chapter 1, which I will talk about, is which I'll focus most of the discussion on, discusses the US military's legal mechanism and process that allowed it to seize privately owned land throughout the island. This emphasis on tracing military land condemnations is the second contribution I believe my book makes. In Pacific Islander studies and on studies of US empire, Guåhan is widely known as being strategically located in the Western Pacific. But what makes the island truly strategic and valuable to the US military is not only its location, but for the fact that the US government owns large portions of the island and that anyone can purchase land in Guåhan. In contrast, the US government and foreign individuals can only lease land in other places in Micronesia, such as the Republic of the Marshall Islands, or in the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands. This means US military bases, like the one located in Kwajalein Marshall Islands, are occupied via lease and have to be reviewed and renewed periodically. Thus, the permanence of US military bases on US-owned land is the primary reason why Guåhan is valuable to the federal government, and which is why I dedicated a chapter to deconstructing this process. In chapter 2, I then examine how American writers also enabled US settler militarism through periodicals such as Life magazine and Leatherneck magazine that credited the military for the modernization of the island's infrastructure. This discourse was essential in concealing the coercive measures that the US military used to condemn land. In chapter 3, I discuss how these newly acquired lands were then converted into bases through the labor of 28,000 civilians, mostly men from the Philippines, and a small number of white American men, primarily from the US South, who provided the bulk of the workforce. In order to manage these workers, the military and its labor contractors created a hierarchical labor system that was based on race and nationality. This examination of military labor is a third contribution I believe my book makes. When we think of Asian or Asian American labor in Oceania, most people understandably think of agricultural workers in Hawaii or maybe even in Fiji. Instead, I focus on Asian labor in the Pacific through my emphasis on the social and working experiences of Filipino civilian military laborers. By doing so, I trace how Filipinos occupy a complicated and entangled position as both settler and colonial subject. This helps expand our understanding of the various kinds of labor that Asian workers did outside of the agricultural plantation labor narrative, while also deepening the relational experiences between Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. In chapter 4, I investigate a variety of the military intimacies that emerged due to the mass migration of workers to Guåhan. Specifically, the US military created laws that were fused in the policing of radical labor organizing and interracial encounters among Chamorros, Filipinos, and white Americans. For the military, regulating these interracial intimacies was instrumental in upholding the US military's reputation as a moral, quote unquote, moral nation, and reducing the possibility of these incidents generating anti-US military sentiment. And in chapter 5, I bring together all of the main themes from my book to describe what it was like to actually live near a base in Guåhan during this time period by using Naval Air Station Hagåtña as a case study. Now, within this narrative of US settler militarism, I also emphasize Chamorro resilience, resistance, and survival. As Native scholar Gerald Visner argues, survivance is, quote, unmistakable in Native stories, natural reason, remembrance, traditions, and customs, end quote. I believe Chamorros demonstrated their survival through a variety of ways, such as continuously sending petitions to US Congress, filing court cases, issuing public critiques that denounce the military, and in some cases, openly violating US military law. My focus on survival also, though, underscores Chamorro cultural continuity through indigenous land stewardship, memory, and custom-bred Chamorro, which means Chamorro custom and culture. Now, Chamorro's survival is poignant given the fact that settler militarism requires the participation of all people living in the island, which enables these structures of power to operate. And so my choice to highlight these voices of resistance does not simply suggest that Chamorros were not complacent or complicit, rather it is an attempt to underscore for how they survived US military occupation. So for the rest of my talk, I'm going to transition into discussing chapter 1 of the book. So in this chapter, I argue that the US military concealed and justified the coercive measures and tactics that it used to confiscate privately owned land through the Liberation of Guåhan narrative, the Guam Land and Claims Commission, also known as the GLCC, and the Organic Act of 1950. The Liberation of Guåhan is the notion that the Chamorros willingly gifted their lands to the US military as an act of reciprocity for its role in ending Japanese military occupation. The US military promoted this narrative as a way to discuss and justify the strategies it used to condemn privately owned land. The GLCC would serve as the institution that legitimized the condemnation of land through declarations of taking, which is an extension of eminent domain, and the legal mechanism that, and essentially served as the legal mechanism that forced landowners to accept cash payments. And then the structure of Western land laws was further legalized through the passing of the Organic Act of 1950, which essentially codified the military's land taking, since Chamorros were now beholden to US federal law, which included eminent domain. Now, in order to fully understand the impact of US military land taking, I'd like to begin a discussion on Chamorro epistemology as it pertains to land. So for Chamorros, land, and by extension, the ocean and sky, is the source of ancestral lineage, cultural perpetuation, and subsistence. Chamorro attorney and cultural preservationist Michael Phillips argues, quote, land on Guam is literally the base of our culture. It incorporates special relationships of clan, family, religion, and beliefs. One example that helps highlight Phillips's argument is an indigenous Chamorro cosmology and epistemology that perceives the human body as an extension of the land, ocean, and sky. This belief is grounded in the creation story of Ponten and Fona, brother and sister gods who sacrificed their bodies to create the island of Guåhan and its people. Chamorros also had other ways that they demonstrated their connection between their bodies and the land. As Chamorro historian Christine Taitano Delau notes, Chamorro patera, which means midwives, would bury a baby's placenta and the umbilical cord under the family stairs of their house or near the house to protect the child from injury or evil spirits, and to connect the baby to their family's ancestral land. Now, what is interesting to me about this practice is that it makes me think of how the act of bearing the umbilical cord and placenta of newborn babies in some ways is a global indigenous practice. Other native communities throughout Oceania and the world also have traditions of bearing the placenta and umbilical cord. So for example, some Kanaka Maoli would place the pico, or also known as belly button, into rock formations in Pu'uloa. Also, some Udo-Aztecan speaking communities would bury the belly buttons of babies as a way to forever connect them to their land. Now, in Native and Pacific Islander studies, we typically think about how our bodies return to the land upon our physical death. But I think the act of burying the placenta is also important because it reminds us that our bodies are always connected to the land, not only spiritually through origin stories or creation stories, and not only at death, but also shortly after birth when the placenta is buried. This is one reason why I believe US military bases and weapons testing in and around Guåhan are not simply the desecration of land, it also represents the elimination of Chamorro bodies via the placentas and umbilical cords that are buried in the land. Now, there are also several other examples, such as the naming of villages and places in Guåhan that are named after body parts. For example, the village of Barrigada, which means side or flank. Tidzin means belly, and that's Tidzin is the site for where Guam's International Airport is located, and the village of Hagatnya, which derives its name from the word Haga, meaning blood. So I believe all of these examples demonstrated a Chamorro epistemology that is rooted in the relationship between people and the land that continues even to today. Now, before the arrival of the Spanish, land in Guåhan was vested in the hereditary control of clans that were spread throughout several villages of the island. The rank and class of each clan determined the land or lands that they had exclusive or shared access to. Even though they did not conceive of land as individual private property, they protected their land against other clans and understood the importance of exclusive communal use. Additionally, this control over communal resources was based on the extended family and was predicated on matrilineal descent. Thus, Chamorro women wielded considerable power since their status determined their children's access to specific areas of land and ocean. Now, during the period of Spanish colonization, the Latsu would emerge as a space that reflected both older and newer forms of land stewardship. By the 18th century, the Spanish crown would introduce the concept of royal and individual land ownership. This would basically result in Chamorros, losing these large communal lands, and instead would be replaced by Chamorros owning smaller lots of land for farming and ranching. Typically, Latsus were located away from residential neighborhoods and church locales. Thus, the Latsu allowed many Chamorros to continue their agrarian lifestyles and indigenous practices without being directly monitored by Spanish authorities. So this is where the histories of Spanish colonization, when it comes to the strategies they used, such as reducción, which when they would take indigenous villages that were scattered all throughout an area, and what they would do is to expedite conversion and to expedite control, they would basically minimize the number of villages and create communities that were centered either on a mission. For example, we're thinking about California's history, or in specific villages, we're thinking about Guåhan, because this would make that process easier. But the Latsus allowed them to escape that daily surveillance by being able to move away from the ranch being able to move to the ranch for a small period of time and then come back to the church during services. So after the Spanish-American War of 1898, the US government acquired all of the land that Spain had occupied. The US military then had absolute authoritarian power over the island and sought to transform Guåhan into a wage labor economy. They did things such as implementing farmer markets and tried to implement agricultural curriculum into schools as a way to encourage Chamorros to sell their crops and livestock as a primary means of income. But what the archives do show is that Chamorros resisted these assimilative policies and did not want to participate in the mass selling of the items that they of the items and goods that they might have ranched or might have grown. Instead, they preferred to barter and trade, or actually simply just give their extra surplus to family members that were in need. And so this, in a lot of ways, upended, right, the U.S. military's attempt to make Guåhan this kind of thriving economic place that wouldn't require, right, the military to or the U.S. government to send money, right, to invest into Guåhan. So even after, though, the pre-war American period, the Latu system continued to provide the space necessary for the perpetuation and maintenance of extended family relationships as it did under the Spanish colonial period. So for Chamorros during this pre-World War II period, they spent a significant portion of their week at the Latu and still do today, giving them an opportunity to socialize with their kin, prepare food, sing, make music, participate in communal labor, and of course, some of our favorite things to do, share gossip, right? Thus, the Latu was an integral part of the Chamorro social fabric, supplying both physical and spiritual nourishment that endured the U.S. military's assimilative policies. And so if you look at this, as you can see in the slides, I have two photographs from two pre-World War II ranches. And one of the slides shows the dwelling, kind of uplifted on pillars. But and so to kind of give you a side view of what some of the homes look like on these Latus. But the other photo with people located, as you can see, people in them, I think is one that underscores the communal labor that Chamorros would participate in as a way of reciprocity, as a way of an alpha malik, right, to kind of practice these principles. Now, World War II and the Japanese military of occupation of Guåhan in December 1941 were integral in the making of the liberation of Guåhan narrative. Now, to give you some context, right, Japan's occupation of Guåhan would last from December 1941 to July 1944. And during this time, Japan attempted to assimilate Chamorros in hopes of creating docile and loyal colonial subjects. This included implementing a cultural and educational program that replicated many of the policies that the U.S. military had implemented before World War II. So in some ways, you can see that that the United States and Japan, entered into this kind of inter-imperial rivalry, right? Even in terms of how they implemented colonial policy. Now, for the Japanese, their goal was to basically create these loyal subjects that could then be exploited for their labor. This strategy, though, would eventually backfire as these harsh educational and laboring experiences were intensified by their mandated roles as civilian military workers, which would then later inform their perceptions of the United States as their liberators. By 1943, the Japanese military accelerated the construction of airfields and fortifications, as well as the production of agriculture throughout the Western Pacific. Many Chamorros were forced to work long, grueling days, clearing fields, dragging large rocks, planting rice, all while being exposed to extreme heat and humidity. So if any of you have ever been to Guåhan, you might know that it has extreme humidity and heat. We're talking like high 80s to low 90s for heat, and the humidity is always upwards to the high 80s, 80%. So as you can see, that's really hot and humid. So for these Chamorro children and adults who were forced to clear jungle and harvest rice in these extreme conditions, their relationship to the land was no longer simply based on stewardship and ancestral lineage. Rather, their labor for the Japanese military linked their blood, pain, and for some death to the land. For those who survived laboring for the Japanese military, their lives were forever impacted by their memories as coerced workers and of the other Chamorros who perished during their brutal working conditions. So in this slide, you can see a photograph of Soledad Chargaloff Flores. And this is actually a photograph of my grandmother, my paternal grandmother. And I never had the opportunity to listen to her talk story about her experiences during World War II because she passed when I was very young. But through oral history interviews that I conducted with other members of my family, and listening to other family members talking story, I learned that she was a child laborer during Japan's occupation. In a lot of ways, she helped clear the jungle for the paving of runways and roads, such as this one. And this is a photograph of Tizen Airfield, which, as I mentioned earlier, is the site of Guam's International Airport. And so what I think is really telling in this photograph, if you can see it on your end, is that there's a certain darker density in terms of color in the back of the photograph. And I think that just shows you, right, the amount of dense jungle that had to be cleared by these Chamorro children and young adults, as you can see in the foreground. And of course, during this time period, they didn't, receive, advanced tools. They were given, rudimentary tools such as machetes, pickaxes, shovels, those kinds of things, right? So I think just kind of gives you a sense of the scale, right, of the labor that went into paving the airfield here at Tizen. So these traumatic experiences, in connection with the land, played an important role in the making of the liberation of Guåhan narrative. The most dominant narrative of World War II is that Chamorros willingly gifted their lands to the U.S. military as an act of reciprocity for its role in ending Japanese military occupation. While Chamorros did initially embrace the U.S. military's reinvasion of Guåhan, they did not simply agree to give away their lands to the U.S. military. Rather, this narrative disguised the process and course of tactics that the U.S. military used in the taking of privately owned land that continues today. So, for example, there are ceremonies such as the Liberation Day Parade, which is one event in which Chamorro scholar Keith Camacho calls the cultures of commemoration that is instrumental to advancing U.S. empire. So in Guåhan today, one time a year in July, everything closes down. And basically it's called the Liberation Day Parade, where the military comes out and they have their soldiers, marching in the parade, and local dignitaries or organizations and the government of Guam comes out and they participate, and people have a barbecue and have a good time, right? It's basically, for Chamorros, it's an opportunity for them to be, in kinship with their family members, but also, right, for others, it's a celebration of liberation. And so, which is also, right, by extension, a celebration of U.S. empire. The U.S. reoccupation of land during World War II was relatively quick along the coastlines and in the most heavily populated villages. Most Chamorros had been displaced from these sites due to combat between the U.S. and Japan, or as a result of Japan's relocation of Chamorros to various labor camps throughout the interior parts of the island. And by the early 1950s, the U.S. government occupied approximately 50% of all privately owned land in Guåhan. Many of these lands were then converted into bases, roads, communication stations, storage facilities, runways, golf courses, and recreational facilities and other military-owned spaces. So one example of this process in which the U.S. Military, right, basically converted lands and kicked and removed people out was in the village of Sumai. So before World War II, the village of Sumai was the commercial and transportation center of the island due to its location on the western coast and for having the best port to host incoming and outgoing ships. Now, during Japanese occupation, Japan came in, kicked all the Chamorros out of Sumai, and then during the U.S. reinvasion, when the U.S. came back, they basically barred Chamorros from being able to return to Sumai. And instead, what they did was they forced the people of Sumai to move into neighboring villages, such as Santa Rita, which did not exist during World War II. So what the U.S. government basically did was it helped fund the creation of Santa Rita, the village, as a way to move out the people of the village of Sumai. So the U.S. military then, what they did was built Naval Base Guam over Sumai, which is still in operation today. So the two major bases or primary bases in Guåhan today are Naval Base Guam, which is over Sumai, and Anderson Air Force Base, which is located in the north. However, in true U.S. military fashion, the Navy allows former residents and the descendants of Sumai to enter the base once a year in an event called Back to Sumai Day, so they can visit their ancestors who are still buried in the village cemetery. So I kid you not, one time a year, the U.S. Navy allows the descendants to come in and they're allowed to visit Sumai and also visit the cemetery that's still there. In many ways, the naval-based Guam is the epitome of settler colonialism in the sense that the Navy has eliminated and replaced what used to be the second largest village on the island. However, it is also important for us to remember that settler colonialism is not always totalizing, and that elimination isn't always permanent due to the persistence of Native memory, resilience, and revitalization. So what I think is important in this kind of back to Sumai Day is the fact that descendants continue to go there, right? The act of even going there and the act of visiting their ancestors is also how we see the embodiment of survival happening, right? Now, I believe what I'm going to do now is play you a quick little clip from an interview that I did with the late Joaquin Perez. I believe this interview underscores Chamorro survival through ancestral memory and resistance to U.S. militarization. This interview with the late Joaquin Perez, who you probably don't know, is that Joaquin Perez was also the former senior policy advisor to Madeline Bordallo, who was Guam's longest running delegate to the House of Representatives. So I'm going to go ahead and play you this clip.
Part of the reason why I have an issue with the U.S. itself and the U.S. possession of Guam, and I'm gonna call it just like it is. Yeah. It is a possession. It's not part of the United States. Everybody likes to say we're a part of the United States. No, we're a possession of the United States, and under the territorial clause, Article 4. Part of my problem with that is when they came in after the war, they literally moved everybody out of Sumai to create what is now called naval-based Guam. And my grandparents, the Pangilinan family, owned a large portion of Sumai. And my grandmother, after the war, told her kids not to accept any money that was put aside by the courts for the condemnation, not to accept any of that money because that was blood money. She had no intention. She did not want to sell the land. Mm-hmm. And as far as I know, to this day, that money's still in the bank.
Excuse me. So what I find most fascinating about this interview is that Perez's grandmother's righteous indignation was the memory of injustice that likely inspired his anti-colonial politics. These memories, coupled with his experience in a summer college program in California, gave him the opportunity to attend protests and rallies that exposed him to the speeches given by Cesar Chavez and Angela Davis. These experiences gave him the tools and courage to form the Chamorro Brown movement of Guåhan in the early 1970s. And the Chamorro Brown movement was the first post-World War II grassroots community organization that was publicly challenged and denounced the U.S. military. Another interesting or fun fact is that, in Guåhan today, it's very common to find Chamorros, and especially Chamorro men, to actually greet each other as saying, "Hey, hafa day, Brown," or "Hey, what's up, Brown?" or "How are you doing, Brown?" And so, one of the things I've always wondered is that if there's a correlation between like the Chamorro Brown movement and how people refer to each other today as like saying, "Hey, Brown," or "hafa day, Brown." And it's interesting because in the interview that I did with Joaquin Perez, I think he actually mentioned that even today he sees people that were part of the Chamorro Brown movement, and they still refer to each other in that same kind of way. So I always kind of wonder if there's a connection there. So maybe one of these days I'll figure it out. All right, and this image you'll see is a map of Guåhan from the early 1950s. And what I think is telling, and as you'll probably notice, is that similar to the cover of the book, is that all the areas in red are actually military properties or military-only property. So just to kind of give you a visual and a sense to see how the scale, right, of military occupation and what it looked like in the early 1950s. Now, the primary institution that legitimated the military's land taking and occupation of privately owned land was the Guam Land and Claims Commission. Now, in order to facilitate the military's occupation of land in the post-war era, the U.S. Congress passed several public laws that included the creation of the GLCC in 1945. The GLCC was the primary institution that legalized the military's confiscation of privately owned land through U.S. law. Now, the commission officials that ran the GLCC were primarily U.S. naval officers who were appointed by the naval governor of the island. This power, I believe, created an inherent conflict of interest since the naval governor typically assigned these commissioned officials who were also naval officers. So commissioned officials essentially were an extension of the military and did not act as a neutral third party. Now, the GLCC's most important role was its authority to acquire land using laws such as eminent domain. And unlike other places in the Pacific Islands, such as American Samoa, the Republic of the Marshall Islands, and the Northern Mariana Islands, land in Guåhan can, of course, be owned by non-Chamorros, whereas in these other places, it can only be leased, right, or given. Now, when the U.S. Navy wanted to acquire privately owned land, they usually sent a GLCC official or officer and a Chamorro interpreter to meet with the specific landowner to negotiate a sale price. And if a person refused to sell their land, the GLCC could simply exercise its authority by filing a declaration of taking with the Superior Court of Guam, which executed the transfer of land to the military in return for money. So this process or procedure is what I think, or what was Mr. Joaquin Perez was referring to about, putting money into the bank and that being blood money. And so that's kind of what he's speaking to, is this process. These officers that were part of the GLCC acted with the belief and intent that landowners had no recourse in resisting the condemnation of their properties because essentially Chamorros were colonial subjects. GLCC senior official Louis Roberts stated, quote, "The power of a sovereign to appropriate for the power of a sovereign to appropriate for public use such lands are necessary is inherent in the sovereign and cannot be questioned," end quote. So essentially, what is at the heart here is, and I think what is important in that quotation is the reference to sovereign, right? And the reference to sovereign is also a reference to power, right? Who has power over the land and who can make those decisions. For the U.S. military, the GLCC was instrumental because it legitimized the process of taking land through Western law, regardless of how Chamorros and other landowners felt. Now, the GLCC and declarations of taking, I believe, also are important because they expand our understanding of U.S. federal policy toward Native people, not just in the Pacific, but also in connection to continental, to the continent. Specifically, what I'm referring to is the creation of the Indian Claims Commission, which was founded in 1946, which was very close to the time that the GLCC was formed. Now, similar to the GLCC, the Indian Claims Commission gave American Indian people in the continental U.S. monetary compensation for past treaty violations and land dispossession in an attempt to absolve itself from future liability. So what the Indian Claims Commission did was it basically would give, right, monetary compensation, and in return, right, to basically absolve itself for any kind of future litigation or lawsuits that might occur or happen later. Now, what I think is really important when we think about the GLCC and the Indian Claims Commission, is that it demonstrates that native land dispossession in Guåhan and in the continental U.S. moved apace during this period and during this post-World War II period. And so, looking at these two things, almost basically happening simultaneously, I think is very telling when it comes to Native studies, right? And thinking about land dispossession. So sometimes what would happen is the GLCC would encounter Chamorros who initially refused to sell their land. And sometimes what they would do is that they wouldn't always just file money or deposit money into the Superior Court. Sometimes they would try to negotiate with these landowners. But what the GLCC would do is use the fear of detention, deportation, and imprisonment to coerce landowners to accept cash settlement. So in the case of Felicita Santos San Nicolas, she recalled her interaction with the GLCC, and she said that a military representative basically came to her home and said that they only wanted to lease her land. And so when they issued her a contract, she did, as you can see, and the quotation says, "What I did not know, because I couldn't read English, was that the papers I was signing were for the actual sale of the property. And only later did I find out the horrible mistake that I was actually selling my property instead of just leasing it." In other instances, GLCC officials used the threat of incarceration to force Chamorros to sell their lands. So Sirkal Sanchez remembered his father's fearful encounter with GLCC officials. He stated, quote, "When my father was still continued to refuse, Mr. Kaminga threatened that my father could be court-martialed. As my father was in the Navy Reserve at the time, he became afraid because he didn't know how to protect himself and didn't want to be thrown in jail and suffer disgrace." So in this case, we can see the overlapping pressures of not just being a landowner and having the U.S. military approach you for your land, but in this case of his father, Sanchez's father, he was also a part of the military and could face potentially imprisonment for resisting. And finally, in Aurelia Francisco's experience, she talked about her husband, and she said that her husband basically worked at the Navy golf course. And what they would do is they would come out and, quote, "They would come out to my husband at his job at the Navy golf course and take him away from his work. They threatened to take him to court and told him that the Navy could put him in jail for refusing to sell. These threats became too much, and so my husband agreed to sign the papers for sale," end quote. And in this case, detention was at the kind of heart of the coercion, where they would actually take him from work to a place that she didn't know, and then basically negotiate or threaten for him to threaten her husband to sell their land. Now, it's also important, though, to recognize the different ways, though, that survival happened, even in the face, of these kinds of pressured situations and these coercive situations. And so in November 1949, in a public hearing in Guåhan, the late CHamoru attorney Frank Leon Guerrero stated, quote, "Most of the people don't care anyway to argue with their government. It must be remembered that the people of Guam have been under military government for 3 centuries. And continuously, Frank Leon Guerrero would also talk about the cultural continuity, because in these same cases, he also stated that, quote, "In the agate land cases, I was the defense counsel for the property owners. None of my clients wanted any monetary consideration. Everybody asked for an exchange in kind. This is the way our people look upon the value of land," end quote. And so, even for the Chamorros that were resigned to just accepting what was happening to them, they still did not want money. Many of them still wanted, they'd still prefer an exchange of land that would allow them to continue to live off of the land. And so by the late 1940s, Chamorro discontent with the U.S. military was brewing. In 1948, the U.S. military attempted to make Tumon Beach into an exclusive military recreation area. In response, the Guam Congress, which was comprised of locally elected Chamorros, issued a letter to the naval governor of Guam that stated, quote, "It is felt by the members of the Guam Congress that all beaches and seas of Guam should be declared public property, and that all persons should have free access to any of these areas for recreational or fishing purposes," so end quote. So, in this statement by the Guam Congress, you can still see, this kind of essence and sensibility that signals to us, Native survival through communal use, saying that it should be used by the community. What I think is also important to think about this incident is that it also gives us insight or a port of entry into understanding land dispossession in other places throughout the world that's in relationship to the U.S. military. Specifically, I think of places like Hawaii, obviously, American Samoa, but also if we think about the Caribbean and Vieques, Puerto Rico. And so in their work on the U.S. Navy in Vieques, sociologist Cesar Ayala and historian Jose Bolivar argued, quote, "What is at stake is not whether property owners rejected some compensation or received some compensation, but the element of compulsion in forcing Puerto Ricans to sell their land is what was objectionable, which was considered perverse." And so in Guåhan, compulsion meant the GLCC's use of coercion that was justified through U.S. law while simultaneously legitimizing the condemning of privately owned land in exchange for cash settlement, regardless of what the landowner accepted payment or not. And so by 1949, what we would see happening is that the fermenting of discontent with the U.S. government would continue. And by 1949, Chamorros would walk out of the Guam Congress as an act of protest of the U.S. military. And so what would basically happen is that the U.S. Government decided that, in response to, this protest, they would now give Chamorros a civilian government, a civilian government instead of being governed by the naval governor of the island. Part of this process included giving Chamorros U.S. citizenship. However, it's important to remember that this U.S. citizenship was limited in terms of the constitutional rights that were given to Chamorros that still continue today. So while the Organic Act did expand the political rights of Chamorros as U.S. citizens, it did not prevent the military's continued theft of privately owned land after 1950. In actuality, the Organic Act of 1950 codified the military's land condemnations and cemented the relationship between the island's political status to military interests and U.S. foreign policy. So, even though the legacy of U.S. military land taking still remains today, it is equally important to consider how Chamorros survival has also persisted in the various ways that include activism, advocacy, memory, protest, and even politics. So for the final interview I'd like to play for you is with Chamorro rights activist and the former leader of Nacion Chamorro, the late Ed Benavente. Like the Chamorro Brown movement, Nacion Chamorro was founded in the early 1990s and is a community-based organization that was an outspoken critic of the U.S. military. In the interview, Benavente discusses the loss of his mother's Lantsu in the area of Tietzen, which is where I showed you that photo earlier, and is home to the international Guam's International Airport. So I'm gonna go ahead and play this clip for you now.
Mention, but the tragedy part was when it was taken away, because then I can't, every time we drive by, even while she was getting sick, my mom was getting sick, she was always sick, point over there, and she had a stroke. She was pointing, and she would tell, it's a boy in Chamorro, it's a got today na, okay, si bishin ng mommies, she would point, and I'm driving down to, to take her to the doctor when she was already in her 80s, and that to me, I let her go, let her tell her stories, even though she was trying her best to communicate. But I let her go because that's what she remembers. So that's, to me, the tragedy part, is that the disconnect between their love for that area, Tietzen, has been spoiled by the perpetual taking of the United States and the condemnations eventually of these lands.
What was she telling you in Chamorro?
She was telling me things like, that place over there was Uncle John's, and
she was talking about her family.
Hierarchy, and that's every Saturday we would have a dinner there, or our dinner there, or a dinner there, and we all will help each other clear the fields to plant more corn or more bananas and stuff like that. So it's just stories like that, something that reminds them about the good things of life, and to them that was the good things of life, their life experiences.
So I find this interview profound for many reasons, but what is most moving to me is that even though Mr. Benavente's mother had a stroke and her health was failing, her memories of her family's Lantsu still persisted. And given the fact that Benavente would move on to dedicate his entire life to advocating for Chamorro rights, his mother's story also reminds me of the quote from the community-based organization TLS Nunavik that states, quote, "If trauma can be inherited from one generation to the next, then so can love, resilience, and wisdom," end quote. So even though U.S. settler militarism altered how some Chamorros perceived the value of land, others continue to rely on the land as a point of reference for ancestral lineage, genealogical knowledge, and subsistence. For example, Chamorro farmer Connie Snipes recalled to me in an interview, quote, she said, quote, "Going out there and taking care of the land, I picture my great-great-grandfather and great-great-grandmother. I'm 65 years old today and I still farm. It's in my blood. When you finish in the evening, it's wow, what a blessing. I can imagine what it was like for my great-great-grandfather," end quote. Memories such as these, I believe, exemplify that for Chamorros today, land still provides the basis for survival through the connection between the ancestors, the living, and for future generations that transcend time and place. So thank you all for your time. I look forward to any questions or comments you might have or any feedback. So thank you for sitting through this virtual presentation of chapter 1 and part of my book.
Thank you, Dr. Flores, for that wonderful presentation on your book. I would like to remind everyone who is listening and tuning in live that there is a chat box that you can put questions into. And as we wait for questions to generate, I'll start off with the first question that I have for you, Dr. Flores. So if you could just kind of describe like maybe some of the breakthrough moments that you had when doing the research or writing the book.
Thank you, Dr. Guåhan. You know, I would say there's two moments. And what I like to say is that the way that these two moments are connected is through relationships, right? Relationships and positive relationships. And so the first one I would say is that, you know, what I was doing was, you know, I did a lot of archival research, traveled to DC and Maryland a lot to do archival research in College Park, Maryland, where, you know, U.S. National Archives are. And at the U.S. National Archives in College Park, Maryland, they have specialists for like different regions and time periods. And so the person in particular that I worked with was a man named Nathaniel Patch. And every time I would go there, I'd always make it a point to say hello to him, to chit chat with, you know, him, and just ask him how his day was going, you know, just building relations with folks, you know, the things that are important and doing that FaceTime that we do when, you know, that's necessary. It's like for even when we go back home. And so it was like after my third trip, I remember, I think it was during my third trip there, he came, I went up to him one day and he said, oh, you know what? I just wanted to let you know, we have about 80 boxes of records coming from the naval government, the Navy coming to the National Archives. He's like, and we have a table of contents that actually will tell you what the general things are in these boxes. He's like, and he told me that what I could do is do a FOIA request, which is a Freedom of Information Act request, to get access to some of these records in these boxes. And so he walked me through the process. He told me what was, like, you know, he walked me through this process. And essentially what I did was I was able to FOIA request 4 books, four to five boxes that were really important because it transformed, I think, chapters 3 and chapters 4, which is on the militarized intimacies and the Filipino laborers in Guåhan. Because one of the dominant narratives of World War II as well is that Filipinos have always been seen as these people who came and rehabilitated the island, right? It's always framed in this like term rehabilitation. And so I'm not saying that that's not true, because, you know, some Filipinos did actually help rebuild like civic buildings and things that weren't part of the military, but they were also building bases at the same time, right? Some of them were building bases, but that narrative, right, is the one that kind of persists. And what these records show was that the US government actually didn't trust Filipinos at all. They said that we have to watch them because they potentially will align themselves with the Philippine government and not with the United States. And so the records actually were of all these surveillance documents. It reminded me a lot of like the COINTEL program that the FBI had during the 60s and 70s. They had very similar things, you know, not to the same scale, but they had these records where they had people infiltrating these Filipino community organizations on Guam. And, you know, it's funny because, right, the narrative today is that, oh, they did such a great job rehabilitating. And I'm like, actually, if you look at the records, they didn't trust Filipinos at all. They were actually, you know, very suspicious and had a lot of anxiety. So that's one, right? The second one was when I was back in Guåhan and I was doing archival research. I was at one of the libraries. I got invited to the library and they said, hey, come to a staff-only lunch. You know, it's only going to be the staff. So I think it's like only like my second week there. So I go, you know, I bring food, you know, with me, which is customary. You know, I greet everyone, you know, appropriately. We're eating, and then, you know, everything's done, and then they're cleaning up. And, you know, the thing I did was I did like what you're supposed to do. You know, I'm like even though, you know, I'm kind of old, but I'm not as old as like the aunties and uncles that are working there, not as elderly as them. So I get my butt up and I start cleaning. I start busting tables. I start taking the trash out, and I made sure I didn't leave until everything was done. And, I did that not because I was hoping I would get something out of it. I did that because that's what I was supposed to do, out of values, out of the principles, out of respect, you know. And, I came back the next day and like they were just like, here's everything. Here's everything we have. You are welcome to look at everything that we have here. And so, like I said, right, it's not like it was a thing where I was expecting something. I was just doing what I was just basically putting, what we talk about in our classrooms about indigeneity, about values, about respect. I put that into like lived action, which is you take care of, community the same way that you read about it, And so I think to me, those are like the two most like poignant and like things that stay in my mind even today. So thank you.
Thank you, Alfred. So the next question I have is, it's about hauntings. I know that you're talking a bit about, people clearing the forest or clearing the land. And if there's similarities between a lot of indigenous cultures in terms of sometimes you're going into places you shouldn't be going, and sometimes you're like asked to do things or move things that are from sacred areas. And so I wanted to like hear a little bit if you heard anything in terms of the oral histories that you did, whether there was good hauntings or maybe some other types of hauntings.
That's a really good question because, if, I had thought about that, I would have asked some of those questions in my interview. So that's a really good question. I wish you would have asked me that years ago. So I would have did that in my interviews because, yeah, I mean, I know, and as you know, we've had plenty of conversations, and everyone else, that might be in the audience might knows that, it's customary that when you enter into jungles or places or oceans or, areas of ocean, of the coast that don't belong, that you're not ancestrally connected to, you're supposed to ask for permission to enter. You're supposed to ask the spirits to let you come in. And so, that's customary even today, right? That you're supposed to do those things. And it's not, we have these spirits called the Tautomona, which are like the ancient spirits. They'll come mess with you, like they'll come and pinch your legs up and you'll have bruises all over your leg. Or, you might have like insomnia for like 2 weeks straight. Like something will happen to you, right? But that's a really good question. Like, I wonder if people, that were laborers at this time who are, obviously being forced into places that they're not from, experience those things. But also, too, I wonder if those people were asking for permission to be there. And maybe, the spirits were also trying to look over them, knowing the fact that they were there not because of their own free will, but because, they were there not because of their own will, but because they were being forced to be there. So maybe the spirits tried to look over them, right, instead of like punish them for not being respectful. So, but nonetheless, that's like a great question to have been able to ask, and I didn't. So, man, I wish I would have had that conversation with you a long time ago. That's a really great thought.
No problem. I was thinking sometimes you'll kind of see peculiar things also in like military records, right? Like, oh, we moved this big boulder to clear for the road, but then the boulder's back where it was. You know what I mean? So,
yeah.
But maybe that could be a topic for future exploration.
There is one story that I heard though, Dr. Kao, which is where supposedly a military officer's young daughter, got lost, and that they had found her like in like some cave like days and days later. But I don't that didn't come though. That story doesn't come from an archive. That came from like word of mouth. So yeah, but there is something like that. That's like the one story I would say is the closest to that.
Yeah, that's just because I'm interested in those, those spiritual hauntings.
Those are good stories.
Yes. And like one of the other things, I think it's important to highlight is, I think there's such few works that deal with, Chamorro history by Chamorros, right? And so along those lines, what advice would you give Pacific Islander undergrad, grad students who are attempting to do research within their communities?
Yeah, I think it kind of, I would say it's kind of an extension or echoing of what I kind of mentioned earlier, which is like, really bring with you, your ancestors, bring the values and principles and morals and ethics that you've been taught by your kin, And I don't want to just say like your family, because you learn these things outside of your family too. You learn from, your kin, right? Which could be much more broader in how we understand family, which is a part of like, how we see bloodlines, right? And blood ties in indigenous societies and cultures and communities. And so use those values, morals, and ethics that you learn and put them into practice. Obviously, when you do research, as a faculty member, I want all of our students, the next generation, to learn, all the theories, all the literature, all the historiography. I want you all to learn that. I want them all to learn that. But I also want them to bring that knowledge of their ancestors and of their kin with them into those spaces, with them into their research, with them into their writing, and most importantly, embody it in your relationships with your mentors, embody it with the relationships of the community that you work with. Because even though you might be from a community, when you I might be from the CHamoru community, when I go and interact with someone else with another part of the CHamoru community that doesn't know me, I still need to put that practice into place. I still need to demonstrate that for those CHamoru's who don't know me, just to make sure that they understand that I'm coming from a place of like caring. And the other thing I would say to anyone that's doing this kind of work is to be patient. Be patient with yourself. And that, at times, even when you're doing this work, especially for, our diasporic, students, is that you're going to make mistakes, and it's okay to make the mistakes. But if you do make mistakes, apologize, do better, and move on, and there's nothing ever wrong to say, I'm sorry, or I messed up. Those are things that are always appropriate. And I think people appreciate those things. And then, do better the next time, try to do better next time. So I think that patience with yourself is also important, that I want students to know about.
Thank you. And then I just wanted to ask you and give you an opportunity to talk about maybe future work that you're thinking about interrogating, what you're currently working on.
Thank you. I have two projects, I'm hoping to be two book-length projects I'm working on. Not that I'm going to get them both done at the same time or anything like that, but there are two different kinds of projects, which the reason why I'm working on them together. I would never say work on two projects at the same time, because it's crazy just to get one done. But the first one is a mixed memoir genre book of like my family and family history, in which, I look at my mother, father, and my grandparents, and I'm writing this mixed memoir genre that's going to be formatted similarly, or is inspired similarly by like Bad Indians, Deborah Miranda's Bad Indians, Bernadette Vicuña Gonzalez's Empire's Mistress, and the other text that is kind of inspires me in terms of form, and is Julian Uggins' Properties of Perpetual Light. And so, part of it, what I'm looking at is like looking at material culture and examining how material culture are things that actually keep history and are keepers of knowledge, and how the ascribed emotions and knowledge and memory and history that comes out from them, stay with us and can then be transferred over to like another generation or another person in your family. And so some of it's through photographs, some of it's like just things that I have on my mother or my father. Like one of the things that I have, I'll give you an example of what I mean. One of the things I have, I'm sorry if I'm going too long, cut me off if I need to stop, is that I have these cassettes of my mom that she used to have all the time. She loved Motown music. She loved Motown music in the 1970s, right? It's good music, right? Motown's good music. So she loved it. She would play it all the time, like whenever she was like cleaning the house or doing chores around the house. And I was really young, I'd be with her. And, of course, Motown is African-American artists, right? We're talking like, Marvin Gaye, right? We're talking Gladys Knight and the Pips, right? Like all that kind of stuff. And I remember, always growing up, she would always tell me things like, oh, you know what? When you get older, she would say, you can marry whoever you want. You don't have to marry a Korean person. You don't have to marry a CHamoru person. You can even marry a Japanese person, she would say. Like, because obviously the colonial history between Korea and Japan, she would be like, you can marry a Japanese person. And she would always, throughout my life, like, have these now as an adult, they make so, and for me, cassettes, that's what's like locked in that memory. It's like all those different moments when she told me, like taught me about race and then by extension, the way she taught me about race really formed my kind of commitment to liberatory politics and liberatory justice, not just for Pacific Islanders and Chamorros, but for everyone, right? For everyone, not just for my community that I come from. So, oh, and I'm sorry, the second one is this more academic, but it's I call it it's going to be a it's called Transoceanic Micronesians, and it's going to be looking at Chamorro and Marshallese community formation in Los Angeles and Orange County. And pretty much what I want to do in intervention into this book is to basically try to bring our two communities more closely, because as you know, you already know, Dr. Cal, and maybe others, you know, of you here, is that in Guåhan, in Hawaii, you know, there's this like negative perception of coastal migrants, you know, and they're racially othered in a way that is like really saddening to me, because at the end of the day, really, they're like our siblings, you know, and they're there. The conditions in which they're there have a lot to do with empire and militarism, you know. And so what I want to do is show that through public health programming, we see these two communities, Chamorros and Marshallese, in the continental U.S. actually overlapping, paralleling, and actually working together, you know, in a way that's productive, in a way that, you know, symbolizes the work that you do, like in transindigeneity, right? Gives us another way to imagine like our relations that are not reflective of like the internalized colonial, you know, lessons that we've learned, right, from the military. And so that's the contribution for that project, or that's what I'm hoping that project will do.
Well, thank you, Dr. Flores, for spending time with us today and talking to us about your new book, Tip of the Spear, Land, Labor, and U.S. Settler Militarism in Guåhan, 1944 to 1962. Please purchase this book, and we're excited to see more work come from you. So I thank everyone that spent their day with us, or a couple hours with us today. Make sure you can tune into our YouTube channel. I want to thank Estella Hernandez for helping us set up this webinar. I also would like to thank Kehaulani Falau and all the viewers here. Please like and share. We're on Instagram and Facebook. Please follow us for more similar events. Thank you.
Thank you.